The Voyage of the Damned. The 18,000-mile voyage of the Russian Baltic Fleet to face the Japanese at Tsushima in 1905 is one of the epics of naval warfare. However, for much of its journey, it was only the strength and determination of its commander, Admiral Russo-Japanese, that prevented it from dissolving into a farce. If it was Russo-Japanese that was cast as the Flying Dutchman in Wenger's opera, condemned to sail the oceans of the world, while the other parts were played by the Marx Brothers. There was even a comic subplot provided by the fleet repair ship, Kamchatka, which could be relied upon for a laugh, even at the most serious moments. The Russo-Japanese War had broken out when, without any formal declaration of war, Japan made a preemptive strike against the Russian Far East Fleet. On the night of April 8th, February 1904, the Japanese torpedoed 2 battleships and a cruiser at Port Arthur. From that moment onwards, the Japanese kept a tight grip on the seas, which the Russians were never able to break. When they did try to break out of the port in August, they suffered resounding defeat at the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Rather than convincing the Russian government that the war was lost, this setback only seemed to make them more determined, and they reached the extraordinary decision that their Baltic fleet, to be renamed 2nd Pacific Squadron, should sail most of the way around the world to meet an enemy who had already defeated a naval squadron stronger than itself. To make matters worse, between the Gulf of Finland and Port Arthur, there were no Russian bases, and no ports of neutral nations, and even those of Russia's ally, France, would be closed to them. To supply the immense amount of coal needed by the fleet, 500,000 tons, Admiral Rosinski had to rely on prearranged meetings at seas, with 60 colliers of the German Habsburg America line. And the length of the journey would mean that his 40 warships would need to recoal as many as 30 occasions, each time in the open sea, subjected to wild weather and heavy waves. Yet, making light of every obstacle, the Russian government sent Ravinsky forth on his odyssey. For all the most impressive appearance of Ravinsky's courtlet of battleships, Karansint, Surov, Boltonaro, Alexander III, and Orelo, the strength of the Russian fleet was more apparent than real. Like many battleships built at the time, they were top-heavy, 1,500 tons above specification, which resulted in a long gestation period during which every new gadget and device was added to their superstructure, regardless of effects and stability. One of the results was that in heavy seas, the second armament could not be used. Another, that the main armor belt was actually below the waterline, thus no defense against enemy shells. The Royal had a sunken anchor at Cronside Harbor a year before because of a mechanical fault, and had to be refloated. So top-heavy indeed were these ships that the Admiral warned not even to raise flag signals, and definitely not celebratory bunting, not that there would be much to celebrate. If the ships looked better than they were, the crews did not even look good in the first place. Few were drawn from the coastal seafaring ports of Russia. Most of the sailors were simply untutored peasants who received little training at the sea, as the Baltic was iced over for half the year. With the greater technical demands of the modern sea warfare, the lack of education of the Russian sailors was a particular drawback. During one training exercise, Ravinsky sprang a surprise alarm, defense against torpedo attack. He waited on the bridge of his flagship, but nothing happened. No men took up their post, for everyone, officers and men, was fast asleep. One British sailor described the Russians he met as odorous, rough, coarse, but a happy lot. An officer aboard the Surov complained about his gunners. One half have to be taught everything because they know nothing. The other half have forgotten everything, but if they do remember anything, then it is obsolete. What no one could have guessed at the outset was that some of the seamen were revolutionaries who tried to foment unrest amongst the crew. It was not a happy situation for any commander. Nor was Ravinsky very happy about his senior officers, describing the obese Rear Admiral Volksrem, his second-in-command, as a manure sack, and Rear Admiral Enskhaven, who commanded the cruisers, as a vast empty space. As the fleet left the Russian Baltic port of Lubao on 16th October, the flagship set the pattern for the entire journey by running aground. A cruiser lost her anchor, wasting hours trying to locate it. While this was going on, a destroyer rammed the battleship Oslava and had to return to Revel for repairs. But once these wrinkles had been smoothed out, the fleet peacefully moved into the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. Here, reports that Japanese had torpedo boats stationed along the Danish coast meant the Russians continuously were on the lookout for spies. Saboteurs are indeed Japanese warships described as trawlers or yachts. The paranoia helps to explain the events of the next few days. The Russian government had paid its agents huge sums of money to prevent any more Japanese surprise attacks. A certain Captain Hartling had been sent to organize counter-espionage in Copenhagen, where he had inhabited a fantasy world of spies and secret weapons, and from which he transmitted daily to the fleet. Everyone, it seemed, was against them, and the seas were awash with Japanese mines, submarines, and especially torpedo boats. The mass hallucinations on part of the Russian crews are more suitable for the subject of psychological studies than military histories. Against this background, Ravinsky ordered that no vessel of any sort must be allowed to get in amongst the fleet. When 2 fishermen were sent out by Russian consular officers to deliver a telegram to the flagship, they were nearly blown out of the water by the terror-happy Russians. In fact, the telegram informed Ravinsky that he had been promoted to Vice Admiral by Tsar Nicholas. Other terrors for the Russians were 2 silvery balloons seen in the distance, but never traced afterwards, which convinced the fleet that the Japanese were observing their every move. As if to lighten the gloom, Kamchatka, self-appointed fleet comedian, reported that she was under attack by torpedo boats. When Ravinsky asked how many, the vessel replied, about 8 from all directions. Naturally, it was a false alarm, but fleet comedians are like that. Once in the North Sea, Russo-Japanese almost brought about a war between Russia and Great Britain, identifying the whole trawler fleet as Japanese torpedo boats. The Russians let fly everything they had. Pandemonium broke loose. The trawlers, known as the Gamecock Fleet, were tiny 100-ton vessels out of Hull, carrying a crew of 8 and fishing on the Dodger Bank. How the Russians could have identified them as Japanese warships is beyond comprehension. Some Russian ships claim they had actually been hit by torpedoes, though in the light of dawn, there were no sign of any damages. It was just another case of mass hysteria. Some sailors on the battleship Bordeaux actually donned life belts and jumped overboard. Others lay prone on the decks with their hands over their ears. Some even ran around the decks wielding cutlasses and shouting that the Japanese were boarding them. Meanwhile, the big guns of the battleship kept firing at the trawlers, damaging 4 and sinking 1, as well as inflicting hits on each other. The cruiser Aurora had 4 hits below the waterline, and the ship's chainline was cut in half by a shell. As soon as he realized his mistake, Ravinsky was like a man possessed, throwing overboard one of his own gunners, who was continuing firing at a damaged trawler. Truth dawned with the coming light that it had been a night of madness, with 7 battleships in line firing at the cruisers Aurora and Dunsky. Fortunately, the gunnery had been deplorable. Orel fired over 500 shells without scoring a hit. But how would the British react to this unprovoked assault on their fishermen? The British press worked themselves into a fury of jingoistic hatred for Russia and demanded war, while the German newspaper Berliner Tageblatt wrote that the Russian commander must have lost his mind. Although the Russian government made an official apology, Britain was slow to forgive. 28 British battleships raised steam and prepared for action, while swarms of British cruisers shadowed Ravinsky's fleet as it moved fearfully across the Bay of Biscay and down the coast of Portugal. The diplomatic storm caught up with Ravinsky at Brno, where he was ordered to leave behind those of his officers who had been responsible for the attack on the trawlers. The admiral took the opportunity, leaving behind his most bitter enemy, Captain Clado. As Clado left the Suboff, another officer was heard to say, see the rats were leaving the sinking ship. But Kata was to get his revenge on Levinsky when he returned to safety to organize reinforcements for the Second Pacific Squad. As anything would do, however unfit and derelict it would be. After all, it would increase the number of targets the Japanese would have to fire at. Kata knew Levinsky had previously condemned these old tubs as worthless and nothing more than a millstone, which would have held back the rest of the fleet. Jokingly, he had called them Sink by Themselves Squadron, but like it or not, he was going to give them. When the fleet reached Tangier, the Kamchatka, which had been detached for some days, caught up and excitedly reported to Levinsky that she had survived the battle of the North Sea, having fired 300 shells from the tussle between the Japanese ships, and vehemently denied that used the Swedish merchantman, a Russian trawler, and a French schooner. Before leaving Tangier, one of the Russian vessels fouled one of the underwater telegraph cables with her anchor and cut off communication between the city and Europe for 4 days. At Dakar, in West Africa, 10 German colliers awaited Levinsky's fleet. Double loads of coal were taken aboard each ship. This had to be stored on the decks, and dust spread everywhere. In the heat of the equator, life became hell for the crews of the Russian ships. The atmosphere resembled a mine shaft, and men died choking in filthy air. During a storm off the coast of Angola, presumably to keep the spirits of the fleet up, Kamchatka signaled to the flagship, "Do you see torpedo boats?" A general alarm was sounded throughout the fleet until the repair ship admitted it had used the wrong code, and it simply meant, "We are all right now." At Cape Town, Levinsky received news that Clado was sending the Sink by Themselves Squadron to join him, so he decided to do everything in his power to avoid a rendezvous with them. He was furious. If they're so old that they can't steam, then they may go to the devil. We have no use for rubbish here. Meanwhile, discipline among the men of the squadron reached an all-time low. Certain by now that they were sailing to their destruction, the Russian sailors tried to make their minds off the future by indulging in all sorts of exotic pursuits. One of them had been bringing pets back with them from shore visits. Unfortunately, some of the pets were unsuited for sea voyages, like the crocodile coming up by the one battleship, and the poisonous snake which nearly killed one of the engineers. On another ship, monkeys and dogs, first wine with champagne, were set to fight each other. The whole fleet resounded to a curious babel of farmyard noises, as pigs, cows, sheep, not to mention parrots, porcupines, chameleons, frogs, and so forth, rushed around the decks, squealing, mooing, barking, squawking, turning the Second Pacific Squadron into a floating zoo. One pet goat lived only on paper, with a predilection for visiting cards. On shore visit, it refused an offer of hay, instead ate a Frenchman's newspaper. Rotting meat had to be thrown overboard when the refrigeration ship Esperon broke down. With the result, the fleet was surrounded by swarms of sharks. For 2 weeks at Madagascar, Admiral Levinsky stayed in his cabin, suffering from acute prurigo, while his chief of staff had brain hemorrhage and was partly paralyzed. Nobody really commanded the fleet. The Russians spent an increasing amount of time ashore at a makeshift city, known as Helva, which sprang up to cater their needs. Saloons, gambling houses, and brothels flourished. Meanwhile, barnacles smothered the whole of the ship, and the speed was cut by seagrass which grew there, and trailed behind as they sailed. Disease was rife in the fleet. Malaria, dysentery, and typhoid took their toll, and funeral services were immediate. The shell she fired on one of her dead turned out to be alive, and she had been unfortunate on the suffering of its war, which seemed to be divided between the foolish troops. Lena takes a bit of overcome by long periods of sleep. Some men on the decks down on ledges for leading the very judgment. expectations were high, therefore the supply ship Garrison arrived, supposedly carrying shells from the back of the ship's main armaments. In the sweltering afternoon, sailors had unloaded the cargo, which turned out to be 12,000 pairs of fur-lined boots and a similar number of Russian boats. At gunnery practice, Ravinsky, who had been renowned for his gunnery as a young officer, watched while his destroyers scored not a single hit on a stationary target. When the battleships joined in, his flagship managed one hit, which was on the ship towing the target. The gunner hoist of one of the battleships jammed because there was a cobra wrapped around the rope. A formation of destroyers, ordered to form line abreast, scattered in every direction because they had not been issued the new code books. Torpedoes were even worse. 7 of them were fired, 1 jammed, while 2 swung at right angles to port, 1 swung at right angles to starboard, 2 tugged slowly ahead but missed the target, and the last went round in circles, causing all the ships to scatter in panic. The Kamchatka, robbed of her chance to join in these capers, signaled instead that she was sinking. Further investigation revealed a cracked pipe in the engine room. Meanwhile, Klado's reinforcements had sailed from Revel under the gentle and frail Admiral Negevov. How this old man felt about his mission is not recorded, but his whole performance in the weeks to come breathed a refreshing air of humanity and common sense into the affair. All the Admiralty could tell him that Ravinsky was currently at Madagascar. Further than that, they knew nothing. They were aware that the commander of the 2nd Pacific Squadron had no intention of rendezvousing with Negevov's archaeological collection of naval architecture. Few admirals had ever set sail with such vague instructions as, "You are to join up with Ravinsky, whose route is unknown to us." For Negevov, it became an exercise in detective work, in which he had to inquire at neutral ports for news of the main fleet and plot his course accordingly. For Ravinsky, it was as if his nemesis followed him in the shape of these ghost ships. Ravinsky suffered the final insult when he read in a newspaper that St. Petersburg had ordered him to destroy the Japanese fleet, to sail on to Vladivostok, and there hand over the command to Admiral Brylov, who was traveling to the Russian Pacific port by the Trans-Siberian Railway. Brylov, known as the Fighting Admiral, had never been in action. After crossing the Indian Ocean, the fleet was met by one of their transports, the Gurkov, which it hoped would bring letters from home. The mood aboard the Russian ships lifted at the thought of hearing from their loved ones, but it was soon dashed when it found out that the transport was still carrying the letters the sailors had sent home from Madagascar a month before. This was too much. The Russians felt completely abandoned, and nobody more than their commander. But help was coming, even though it was as unwelcome as an attack by Japanese torpedo boats. The 3rd Pacific Squadron, the Floating Dead, were about to join them. On May 11th, off the coast of Indochina, the two fleets met, although Ravinsky did not welcome the new arrivals. At least they brought news from home of unrest, mutiny, and revolution. Ravinsky was nearing the end of his voyage. In many ways, he had achieved a miracle in getting this far, and it was not his fault that the ships and crew that were apart being sent against the Japanese were not adequate to their tasks. Had he known this from early on, he would have struck at his job like an admiral going down with his ship. In a sense, the whole voyage resembled a protracted sinking, though only his iron personality had the Russian commander managed to starve off the final cataclysm. But the stress of command had worn away at his health. By the time he met the ebullient and immensely competent Admiral Toga at Fukushima, the island aptly named the Donkey Ears, he had accepted fate's decree that he should be the victim. The destruction of the Russian fleet that followed was a one-sided encounter in which the Japanese achieved one of the most crushing victories in naval history. Ravinsky was denied the chance to perish with his flagship, being plucked wounded from the sea to a Japanese hospital, where he was later visited by Togo himself. On his return to Russia, he found himself, as he expected, to be the scapegoat. Witnesses had reported that during the battle Ravinsky had been delirious, but he was long past that stage. It was fatalism that commanded the Russian fleet at Fukushima, and fate had not quite finished laughing at Ravinsky. While staying at a hotel in St. Petersburg in 1908, he received a telegram giving details of record service in his memory to be held in the city. Apparently he was dead, and no one bothered to tell him. So ends the tale of the Russian Baltic Fleet.